Welcome. You are joining us here at Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop. This is our panel and discussion on sustaining your book length project. And we will be beginning in just a minute, letting everyone in from the virtual doors. And I'm just going to, my name is Joy Baglio. I'm the founder and director of Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop. So I'm just going to run through a couple of quick announcements and welcome you and read our intro, our bios for our panelists, and we will begin discussion. Let me just introduce you to who we are if you're new and joining us. So Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop is a literary arts organization, and we're based in Northampton, Massachusetts, but right now everything we do is virtual. And every season, our main offering is a series of workshops, one day and multi-week. And we also have a year-long program of workshops in all genres that currently right now is accepting applications. That happens every year. So I am going to introduce you to our panelists. I'm so excited to feature them all. They are our wonderful instructors of the year-long program. So first, we have Kate Senecal, who is PVWW's assistant director. She's also the program director of our year-long manuscript program, and she's the leader of the program's year-long novel workshops. She holds an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts and is the former fiction editor of StoryCorps. Her short fiction has been published in Water Wheel Review, the Laurel Review, the Foundling Review, and in StoryCorps. She is at work on a first novel. Also, we have Sara Rauch joining us. She leads PVWW's year-long short story workshop, and she's the author of the short story collection, What Shines From It, and the forthcoming book-length essay, XO. Her prose has appeared in Paper Darts, Autofocus, Hobart, Split Lip, So to Speak, and more. She holds an MFA from Pacific University and lives with her family in Holyoke, Massachusetts. We also have the wonderful Celia Jeffries here, and Celia is our current leader of the year-long memoir workshop at PVWW. She holds an MFA from Lesley University and is the author of the novel Blue Desert, which came out in 2021. Her work has appeared in numerous newspapers and literary magazines, including Westview, Solstice, and Puerto del Sol, among others. She's received grants from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Turkeyland Cove, and La Muse. She is currently working on a memoir. We also have Carolyn Zaikowski joining us. She leads both the year-long nonfiction manuscript workshop and the year-long poetry hybrid workshop. She's the author of 2 hybrid novels, In a Dream I Dance by Myself and I Collapse, and the other novel is A Child is Being Killed. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared widely in such publications as The Washington Post, Denver Quarterly, The Rumpus, West Branch, Pank, Huffington Post, among others. She holds an MFA from Naropa University's Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics and is currently an English professor and death doula. She lives in East Hampton, Massachusetts. Also, we have Dorian Fox joining us, and I'm so happy to welcome him to PVWW and also to the year-long manuscript program, where he will take over teaching the memoir workshop, the year-long memoir workshop next year in 2022. His essays, articles, and stories have appeared in a wide range of literary publications, including Brevity, The Rumpus, Atticus Review, McSweeney's, Internet Tendency, Creative Nonfiction's Sunday Short Reads, and others. His work has also been honored in various competitions and received nominations for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net. He lives in Brighton, Massachusetts. And although it's always a little awkward, I will introduce myself. I am Joy Baglio. I'll be moderating. I'm the founder and director of Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop, which I began in 2016. My short stories have appeared in Conjunctions, Tin House, American Short Fiction, the Iowa Review, and elsewhere. And my work has been supported by places like Yaddo, Vermont Studio Center, the Breadloaf and Sewanee Writers Conferences, the Elizabeth George Foundation, and the Speculative Literature Foundation. I have an MFA from the New School, and I'm working on a novel and a short story collection. So I also want to say, I forgot to big welcome to all of our year-long manuscript group, current students, current workshop attendees, people of the PVWW community, and also anyone joining us for the first time. I'm really happy that you're here. Thank you for tuning in. So before we dive in to discussion, and before the panelists respond to various questions that I will ask them, I just wanted to say a few things about the purpose of this panel discussion. That it basically is to shed some light on this very nebulous, hard to pin down, hard to make sense of process that is book length work. How people are able to do this crazy thing of creating a whole book and getting to the end of it. I often find myself just in awe of how many wonderful books are in the world. And I'm sure we've all felt this, that each one is the end result. It's like just the iceberg tip of someone's years of struggle, years of like planning, late nights, trying to balance writing and work. So we're seeing just this little fraction, this end result. And there's so much to talk about, like how that happened. So we'll probably only scratch the surface of all of that today. And also, I just want to acknowledge too, like how difficult this work is. Difficult on a craft level, on an emotional level, on the level of time and figuring out our schedules and when to fit it in, and how frustrating it is. But despite that, despite all those struggles, that there's something very compelling. Like we who feel called to do this work somehow are compelled through all of it to keep going or to try to find a way. And there can be joy and fun and play in that whole process despite all the struggle. And I thought of two quotes I just want to share briefly with you before we begin discussing. One is Gwendolyn Brooks, who says, "Art hurts. Art urges voyages, and it is easier to stay home." Thanks to Gail Thomas for sharing that in one of her workshops, because it has been rattling around in my head ever since I heard her share it. And it's so true. It's so much easier to say no to the project and to not figure these things out and to kind of just stop doing it. It's something so much easier about that. And then the other one I wanted to share on this topic of struggle and frustration is Elizabeth Gilbert, who says this in Big Magic: "If you want to be an artist of any sort, then handling your frustration is a fundamental aspect of the work, perhaps the single most fundamental aspect of the work. Frustration is not an interruption of your process. Frustration is the process. You don't just get to leap from bright moment to bright moment. How you manage yourself between those bright moments when things aren't going so great is a measure of how devoted you are to your vocation and how equipped you are for the weird demands of creative living. Holding yourself together through all the phases of creation is where the real work lies." So on that note, I want to ask all of our panelists if they can, to start just by telling us a little bit about your own process in book length work. Pretty much, let's focus first to you as a writer, because I know we all teach writing too, but you as a writer, what does your own process look like for book length work? What are you working on? And how do you normally work? And how do you, as Gilbert says, how do you hold yourself together doing that work through all the different phases? So let's start with Kate. I see you first.
Okay. Well, I'm working on a novel, and my process is sort of circular. I feel, in the first drafting window, it feels really important to me to be able to just get as much on the page as possible. But I also know that I can be a bit of a perfectionist. So if I'm feeling like something isn't working, like I will allow myself to revise a little bit just so I can move forward. But my process is generally that I give myself 3 to 4, 1 to 2 hour slots a week to work. And then I do some pretty robust brainstorming and thinking time in between sessions so that I'm positioned to sort of make the best out of that hour that I have. So I usually sit down with a plan that's like, okay, I'm going to write this scene. And I might look at the scene that I did last time before I keep going. But one trick that I do to make sure that I'm not constantly like revising the same chapter in the first draft is that when I get to the end of what I think is a chapter, then I have to put it away. So my novel is sort of organized in a big folder that each chapter has its own document. And then there's like one full Word document that has the full manuscript. But that was sort of a compromise I came up with myself. That was like, I know I need to tinker with the sentence, but I also know that I can really get stuck there. So that's what I decided to do to handle that.
Oh, I wish I could say that I sit down and write 9 to 5 every day, but I'm one of those binge writers. And I think because of my background in news, I do a lot of writing in my head. Because in news, I had to get the lead before I could start the story, so I would just churn away at it. So I tell my classes that, you know, part of what the year-long program is finding your own process. And, you know, some people work really well with deadlines. Some people work well with accountability. Some people go back and forth, but I love Kate's trick. I like the idea of putting things aside, because I think my biggest problem is always impatience. Okay, got that done. And it's never done. So one thing I believe in is cross-training, is trying other things. And I have written my entire novel in limericks, because when I get really frustrated, I write limericks. So, and then something comes out of a limerick. So try anything and just stay open. It's sort of my motto.
Yes, and sometimes you you like trick yourself to doing the work you really want to do by adding something like that, like the limerick writing. Similarly, that I sometimes write in second person to, it seems to kind of unlock something for me. So I use it, yeah.
I really appreciate what you guys just said. I'm gonna go to like my big obnoxious thing I always talk about. I sometimes call myself obnoxiously intuitive. I just really like the beginning part of the writing process, which for me is like a much more intuitive part. I kind of am interested in the psychology of the beginning of the writing process and how I'm just staying. Like I've found that in Western culture, I don't know, I think it's capitalism. We're like really product focused to the point where we almost feel entitled to product. It's fascinating. And we don't kind of honor, or it took a while for me to realize that I wasn't honoring when, you know, the glorious mess, so to speak, of the beginning parts of the writing process, and like throwing myself into being a bad writer, holding stuff lightly, like, you know, bad writer, holding stuff really lightly, like kind of my revision process is much more organized and sort of methodical, but the beginning of the process, you know, it's like Joy, you said, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. The product is the tip of the iceberg. It's like, I always think of like theater and sports. They do like scrimmages and practice, and like artists who do that whole thing with the, they're like going like that, and they're like that whole thing with like sketching and drafting. And I just find that writers don't like the beginning of the writing process. Like there's this antagonistic attitude towards it. And so shifting that for me has just been revolutionary. Like I like the beginning of the writing process. It's messy. I don't sit there and write every day. I have a job. There's a pandemic. It's fine. I don't write every day. I always come back to writing. And it's partly because I've started to trust, you know, the creative wellspring. Like you don't expect to have a baby and suddenly they're 18 and at Harvard. Like you guys know all the things that come before having a baby and getting them to age 18. So I kind of see the product is like the last 5 minutes of like this years-long process. And I just think that's really, really cool. I think it's really cool. So deciding to think that that was really cool, like just unlocked everything for me.
Cool. Yeah, no, I totally agree that like we're the muscle of creating like a routine and just adding writing to our life is sort of much more important in a lot of ways than the product, what comes.
Yeah, I love that idea of embracing the mess, and also what you said, Celia, about every writer having to sort of find their own process or discover their own process, because I think it is really idiosyncratic, which can make it hard to teach, because there's no sort of one size fits all
Right.
way to coach people on how to begin a book length project, let alone continue with that process until they get some pages generated and have a fair amount of progress made. So the last few years I've been writing shorter pieces, actually essays, mostly personal essays. When I was in my MFA program, I was working on a book length memoir, and I made a fair amount of progress on that, but kind of put it aside and turned toward shorter pieces that I think will amount to a collection of essays eventually. But I guess if I had to boil it down, the thing I try to do in my own practice, and also what I encourage other writers to do, is to try to cultivate a balance between a kind of explorative mode, and this kind of gets to that mess idea where you're willing to make mistakes, you're willing to explore, you're willing to open doors where you're not sure what's on the other side and see where it takes you in the writing process. So balance between that sort of thing, which is sort of messy and uncertain, and intention and planning. So if outlining helps you, to find some direction in your writing process, I think that's fine, and it can be helpful. I think it's good to pay some mind to what the parameters of this book are going to be, and what scaffolding you might use to organize the material. But I think when writers start leaning too far in that direction, it can actually shut down some of the exploration and leave you less open to that mess, which is can be a really I think fruitful thing. The mess and the uncertainty of just diving into the material every day and seeing what happens. So it's easier said than done, but I try to myself, and also when I'm instructing others, to help people strike a balance there.
Well, I'm not sure I have anything to add to this. I agree with it, pretty much everything everyone is saying. I really, Carolyn, I hate the beginning part of a project. I'm kind of in the beginning of a new thing right now that I don't know what it is, and it's so hard to trust it. I mean, eventually you do. Like my big thing is like showing up for it, reappearing for it. I try to write a little bit every day. I have kids, so I can't often write for longer than, like, say, half an hour when I get when I can squeeze it in. So I try to do it as often as possible. But I think at some point you do kind of click into that mess, and then you kind of maybe pick up speed a little bit. And it really is like kind of trusting it. And it sounds maybe it's difficult to like understand it when you're not doing it, but you really do. You kind of lean into it, you trust it, you approach it, you back off, you give it a chance to rest, you come back to it. And I don't know, eventually you have a thing, eventually you know what you're doing. I'm not an outliner at all, ever. So eventually though, I do find I have a thing, and I'm like, oh, this is what I'm doing. It took however many months to figure it out. I think of it a little bit now as like a process of collage. So I'm like pulling, okay, here's a thing. I kind of like this, and like, here's a thing, and I'm going to put it next to this. And here's a thing. It might be obvious that I don't write linearly from that description, but I think, eventually a kind of timeline or a kind of linearity appears sometimes, depending on how those collage pieces come together. But I think it is there's a big element of trusting that you as the writer will find the material will find you, and that it will become what it needs to become.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of it as a collage. And yeah, I completely, the element of trust, and like, I keep coming back to the idea of trusting the process. And like, the more times we go through a process of, we've started something and somehow we've gotten to the end of it, the more time we go through that process, the more we trust, even when it feels like nothing is working, and we trust that we will get through it somehow. So I really think trust is so crucial to just creative work, and trusting that we know that we don't need to know maybe what will happen. But I want to talk a little more specifically too about some of the hurdles, like the very particular struggles that people face when doing this, when particularly working on something long over a period of time, sustaining it, trying to, I mean, there's all the different ways that we might struggle with it, right? There's like trying to fit it into finding the time to do it. And then there's also sustaining our own interest in it and the right mindset to even do the work. So I wonder if you could share a particular, what maybe like, let's just say like the struggle that you feel comes up most in your creative work. And I'm actually going to combine this with another point just because of time, like, and how basically a breakthrough, like, have you broken through that? Have you found a way to address that struggle, or are you still struggling with that?
I'm just laughing because my biggest struggle is impatience. And I love what Sara said about trusting, because my novel was, sometimes I call it a very difficult long-term relationship. I mean, we broke up a few times. I put it in the drawer, that's dead. So trusting, like James Baldwin said, you don't get the book you want, you get the book you get. And I think that's what I see. So that was my biggest problem. And once I gave up the idea that this book should be a certain way, then it started to work. I gave it more time, and it would take as long as it took. I'm not going to tell you how long it took because it's embarrassing, but it's done.
I have no problem telling you how long my most recent book has taken to write, which is 16 years with many years in between. And that's entirely normal. So I want to normalize that for folks. Yeah. It takes a long time to write a book. Like, I think that's a struggle that people don't honor. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to say, just in terms of another thing that I have just needed to own and honor is stress. Like, people have stress. It's a pandemic. There's social upheaval. People have kids, jobs. Mm-hmm. Many of us have chronic illnesses. Like, it's just a lot of practical things can get in the way. And I don't know what the answer to that is necessarily. But I just want to normalize that too. I can tell you that a breakthrough moment I had, a teacher I had, Dodi Bellamy, said to me something like, "Where did you get the idea that you needed permission to need permission?" And that, nothing was the same after that. I was just like, oh, I can do whatever I want. Mm-hmm. I can, so long as it's not harming people, obviously. I can have whatever process I want. I can stop. I can de-stress. I can wait. I can binge write. I can write in whatever genre I want. Like, I can write about whatever I want. Like, I've had a couple of related epiphanies around like plot points where I was like, I can't write that. And then I was like, wait, why can't I write that though? I'll write that. So you don't need permission to need permission was a big epiphany on all kinds of levels for me.
I have my big thing is sustaining interest in a long-term project. Like, I get bored really easily. And to Carolyn's point, at some point I just had to say to myself, like, well, yeah, you're going to get bored. You're going to get bored. You're going to get distracted, go away, do something else. You'll come back to it. You'll come back to it. You'll come back to it. I almost always do, but for a while I would fight the boredom. And then I realized, like, don't fight the boredom. The boredom's going to open up something else, something different, and you'll come back to it. And so I think that kind of knowing yourself, but also, like, if you're a person who gets bored and you need to move around in time and in projects, then that's good. Like, embrace that, because your subconscious is working on all this stuff even when you're not working on it. So it's like, allow the boredom, allow that kind of thing, and it opens up. You will come back to the projects that you are meant to or want to finish.
And I really do feel like, to what you were saying, Sara, that there's something will be dormant sitting around on my desktop for over a year or something. And then all of a sudden something in my life will maybe speak to that. And suddenly it comes awake, comes alive. And like, there's something fixed about it too, that I wasn't able to often get in that moment. So I do think there's something really, like, just wonderful about having these dormant projects that you don't feel compelled to push all the way to completion in the exact moment it comes to you. And I know we all work differently, but I found that to be really powerful. Anyone else want to share about we're talking about moments of struggle, a particular challenge in sustaining a long project that you are either dealing with or that you overcame in a particular way or had a breakthrough about? Anyone else?
I think like one hurdle for me, I think, is rigidity. Like I feel like when I started to write the novel, I thought that the process would be, I'm really process oriented and I want to know what the rules are. I want to know how to do something. And that is like a really difficult mindset to have in the creative sphere. And I feel like what worked for me process wise in the early stages of the novel, like don't work anymore, because the book, as it sort of comes into itself, the story exists on new terms. And also the closer it comes to being done, like the less mine it is, if that makes sense. So I really had to kind of get to a place where, like Sarah was saying, that I had some emotional flexibility where like, I thought the plot was going to move in a certain way or certain characters were going to be different people. And now that I'm like 3/4 of the way through the first draft, I am like, well, the things I thought were true just aren't anymore. And it doesn't feel intuitively like the right thing to wrestle my characters into the shape that I thought they would take. So instead, I've had to cultivate a really interesting and fun attitude of curiosity. And I think we'll keep coming back to this idea of trust. It's like one of the reasons that I'm in it, like that I'm even working on a book is because I feel curious about what my own brain can do. And that is a nice feeling. Like what might I be able to create? And that takes some pressure off in a weird way. Like it's as if I'm having a transaction with my work rather than like like you got to force it out and get to it. And that's really softened a lot of areas, just by being like, well, I guess it's like this today. Let's see where that takes me.
Yeah, that attitude of just sort of accepting what is for today and not resisting. I mean, it really comes down in so many ways. I'm completely with you. I do want to skip ahead a little to past some questions I was going to ask, just because time is sort of moving on. I want to make sure we cover some stuff that is pretty practical, pretty like resource-based for people that are looking for that. So I want to ask about any particular tips, advice, resources, things that are pretty like nuts and bolts about that you've used to get yourself unstuck or keep yourself going. And I'm also going to just, while you're thinking about that, I see a question. Whit is asking about books or resources to recommend. So if you have any of those too, we can share some of those on revision, he says. So I'll start by just saying something that was pretty mind-blowing for me in terms of a book on revision was George Saunders' new craft book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. I think I'm saying the title right. Kate has it. Yes, thank you, Kate. And it's just pretty mind-blowing how he talks about revision as this process of exposing the work repeatedly to inflicting yourself repeatedly on the work. I just love that idea that through this slow process of day after day of inflicting yourself on the work, a kind of better self emerges, a voice that you could not craft in just one sitting. And it really, that idea has just I feel it like very liberating in my own work. It doesn't have to be perfect one day that you sit down. It doesn't have to. It's a process that happens over a lot of time, and there's no real. You're the one who decides when the end date is.
I'll just quickly say, people, stop hating yourselves. And I don't even mean that in like a self-love Oprah way. I mean that it literally is the least helpful thing ever to be judging ourselves and hating ourselves. Is just like, stop, stop. It is like the least, like it serves no purpose and it's not true. And it's like, we need to come together and like not be in competition. And we need to, I'm not going to say love yourself because that's near, I know that that's harder. It's easy for me to say like than it is to actually do. But there is this thing in the writing community of people judging themselves so much. And we just really need to stop. Like, I don't know what else to say. It's just like, stop.
I think we're all,
it's hard to turn off that inner critic, right? It's like always present,
Yeah.
even just like in how we talk about how we work.
Yeah.
But it's
the
true, you really
biggest-
have to shut that voice down. It's so hard to get anything done when that voice is like,
Yeah, it's the biggest psychological barrier. And it's just like, we need to like be brave and just stop. Yeah.
I've been thinking actually a lot about this as like self-critique as a barrier. And I think we often talk about it like it's like it's pure, like it, as a purely emotional thing, but from a very practical standpoint, like that inner voice and leading with the question, is this good, is going to be the primary barrier that any of us encounter with the novel writing. And I think that the way, like Marnie's asking in the chat, like, how do you shut them up? Like, you just don't feed them. You just have to ask different questions. And this is kind of the thing with revision too, like, do not lead with, is this good? Like, the answer is probably not yet. Like, it takes a long time for it to be good. That is not the goal. The goal is, a better question is, what is this? What did I just make? And what, what does it want to feel like? What does, like, how can I, I think like A Swim in a Pond in the Rain is a great example, because Saunders spends a lot of the book like coaching writers into asking good questions about their writing. Like, you write a paragraph and then you look at the paragraph and you say like, okay, well, what am I noticing here? Like, what's happening, right? And then maybe a character is doing something. So maybe ask, why are they doing that? Or like, what might that mean? I think, and another thing I'll say about revision and asking questions in the spirit of sort of not feeding your inner critic is, sometimes I think for any book length project, it's important to know like the bigger picture of what you're trying to talk about. Like, what, if someone asks, for a long time, someone would, anytime anyone asked me like, well, what is your novel about? I would like feel compelled to give like a plot summary. And then I realized it's like, the plot stuff doesn't matter. Like, I'm writing a book that is like about motherhood and about other, like about climate change and about like whatever. Like, so often when I'm revising, I kind of come back with ideas of like, well, what am I trying to talk about here? Like, am I doing myself the most justice in the way that I'm bringing the story alive? And I think if you can get really lost in the questions that your book is presenting you, you don't have time for the critic. They're not even like a part of the game, like, it really is like, if you're building like a model car, you don't stop every 5 seconds and be like, is this good? Does this look right? Like, you just build the model. And I think that kind of mentality with creative projects is like, you're teaching yourself how to do it. And you're teaching yourself how to do it as you go along. And like, the judgment will come later, but like, put it off as long as possible. Like, when you ask for feedback, don't ask people if it's good. Like, ask, what do you notice? What do you think I did here? And they may give you an answer that's like totally opposite of what you think that you did. And that's much more helpful than someone being like, hey, I think this kind of sucks. Like, what do you, like, no one is going to say that to you. So don't say it to yourself, So yeah, I think revision to me is about asking good questions. And I think freeing yourself from the inner critic is also about asking different questions.
Yeah, I agree. That's very well said. I agree with a lot of that. And I agree that this question of, is this good, especially in the early stages of a project, it just seems like the wrong question to ask, because it goes back to this idea of the mess. It's going to be messy. It's going to be imperfect. It's going to be trying to become, what it's eventually going to be. And that's, that can be a pretty roundabout and long process. But it is hard, I think, to turn off those voices. I mean, writers tend to be self-critical. We tend to be overthinkers, right? And I think we tend to be hard on ourselves and our work for those reasons. But yeah, to try to push those critical inner voices away and just embrace the messiness and embrace that idea of trust that people mentioned. I had the word faith written in my notes here, but I think it's I was thinking about a similar a similar approach of just trusting that given enough work and a sustained practice, of writing and time, the work will become what it needs to become, but you do have to stick with it. And sometimes sticking with it requires you to, try your best to silence some of those deeply critical voices that are always going to be kind of lurking around, the edges of our minds as writers.
Don't take the writing process so personal.
Yeah.
Or the inner voice. It's really just a universal thing we're all going through.
I'm gonna actually pull some questions from the chat. Otherwise, I think we probably won't get to them all, enough of them, or many of them. So Fungi asks, writing is a very solitary process. How does leaning on a community of writers help you stick to a project, if at all? So anyone have thoughts on that? This aspect of how can community help a project, or is it perhaps just a solitary process? Where does community fit in? Sarah, I'm going to go to you first.
I was just thinking, this kind of comes back to this kind of knowing yourself idea of writing. I tend to work with only one or two other people kind of in a regular check-in way. We don't share work, we just talk about what we're doing. And that helps me kind of just stay on track and stay kind of attentive to what I need to do. But I know lots of people who love writers groups and love having like a bigger community and sharing their work in a more, in a bigger way. So I think it really depends on what works for you. What kind of feedback do you like? What kind of engagement do you like with your community? And then figure out what you like and then do that thing.
Okay, Kate, then Celia. Sorry, you feel free to jump in too. I'm only doing that just for ease and smoothness.
I think a big part of my process is actually verbally processing my story. So I feel lucky because I'm married to someone who's like willing to listen to me prattle on about plot, or and is reading as I go. So I do have a couple of readers that I don't ask for critique, but just we exchange pages as we go, and then I have someone to talk to when I'm like, I'm not sure what this character should do in this situation. Normally, I don't really need input. I just need somebody else to hear, and then I can come to the decision on my own. But I think sometimes the solitariness is really useful when I'm actually getting words on the page. But I tap into community in all kinds of ways around the edges of that. Like in even just having conversations with students and peers about craft, or talking about other books, like just reading a ton and talking about those books, like all of that stuff feeds the book. And I do think, to Sarah's point, sometimes, just having like a regular Zoom time where two of your friends, you'll meet once a week and you'll write in silence together. I think that can be really useful too. Yeah.
I'm probably going to say exactly the same thing that both of them have said. I also think that working with others comes at different points in the work. I think when you're dealing with the big mess, it's great to be getting prompts and digging into the mess. It's also good to have some people that you work with on a continual basis. But I think you also reach a point when you're in a long book or a long process where you don't want too many voices in your head, where you get to a point where you've taken in a lot of feedback. And there's a point where I've seen some people in the chat saying they went away for 2 days. And yeah, go away with your work and live with it. So I think you go back and forth, as Kate said, in and out of community. But I also think we are so blessed to live in Italy where, there's a huge community. I've lived places where there isn't. And so to be able to go out and find other people who are interested in writing and struggling with you, I think that's a real gift. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think one of the questions that I found myself wrestling with and coming to different answers over the years is just, what do I need to sustain the work? And it's changed over the years. Sometimes I need community, and I find that it's the community that keeps me writing, whether what Kate said, like we're writing together on Zoom, or we're just like sitting there and seeing other people writing actually gets me writing, right? It's that mirror neuron thing. Like we see others writing, we want to write. So there's that. But then there's other times where I'm just like, people offering to be readers or wanting to exchange work, and it's just not the right thing at the moment. And I know the work is not in a place where that's going to benefit me or anyone. And so I think it's really just being honest with yourself too about what you need at a certain time to actually keep the work alive in you and to keep your motivation where it is. Personally, I've felt the biggest barrier to novel work for me is my own waxing, waning level of interest and motivation in the project. And there's all different ways that I think people can deal with that. One, I'll just share a couple of quick things before we take more questions. But one thing I do is I try to lessen the pressure for myself in various ways. So I will like record on voice memos, right? It's like so not serious. How can I stress about that? I'm just kind of recording ideas. I will write about the project. I will literally open a different document and I'll describe some stuff that is not even on the same document. Or I work in Google Docs, I will do a comment. I'll literally like be writing a comment. It's not even in the text. So it's sort of something about that tricks myself into it's not the serious work. It's a comment, but it often becomes a scene or it becomes something else that works its way in. So there's different ways that you can find, depending on what you need to do the work. You don't always have to work in the same way. What needs change and processes can change.
Very true. And Joy, I just want to say that I think each project, the process changes. You might discover you're gonna write a first book or any book, and you're like, yes, I discovered the process. And then the next book, it's like, nope, totally different. Got to figure it all out all over again. Right. And that's part of the fun. But also, it's true that stuff is going to change constantly, so you have to like kind of just embrace that's reality. That's the reality of doing this kind of thing.
I just want to jump back in for a minute about writing in community, in that it's another antidote to that nasty editor on your shoulder, because sometimes people hear things you would dismiss. So it's often I have actually had short stories where I never would have gone back to it, except somebody made a comment. And I went, well, I'll look at that again. So that's one benefit of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw somebody in the chat, I missed who it was, but somebody had asked, like, how do you find that objective distance from your work and kind of back up from the work and see it more clearly? And I think that goes to exactly what you're saying, Celia, that when we get to a point where we actually can't see our work clearly, we can't see it for what it is, to put it in front of somebody else's eyes and get their take on it can be a kind of reset for us, or it could at least be illuminating and clarifying for us. And we come back to that piece or that chapter or whatever it is with a new sense of possibility. So it can, I totally agree, it can break that cycle of kind of self-criticism and all those forces that want to kind of shut down a certain project if we get too negative about it.
Yeah, I would say I think there's a lot of things that writers get stressed about that are actually really cool things, and we like assume we have to be stressed about them or something like that. Which the fact that our writing process changes or that our life changes and different things and surprising things happen, that's really cool, you guys. Like that does not have to be related to as stressful, or like the fact that we have, I call it dormancy. It's like planting the seeds and trusting the process. The seeds are doing things and you don't like just neurotically rip the seeds up and are you done? Are you done? Are you done? It's like, no, the seeds. This is so cool. Like I planted seeds and I'm watering them with reading or with being around other people or, with giving them time or like, that's really cool. Or any other number of things, like Kate was talking about, the project organically unfolding, like that's not stressful. That is really neat that a project can start just showing you what it is. But if you don't relate to that the right way, it's like, oh my God, like it's not following my outline, like, oh my God, but that's, so I guess one of my themes for today is like, there's a lot of ways to shift the mindset to like help open up so many worlds for not being so stressed. about any of this. So I would just invite people to like maybe just try that on.
That reminds me a lot of, I was just poking through Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, trying to find some inspirational stuff right before this. And she talks about trickster energy, the idea of like any trickster through mythology or folklore, like the energy behind the trickster, like what they trust in, which is essentially the chaotic creative nature of the universe. And I just thought that was such an interesting idea of like, there's an unpredictability to it, but it's also sort of what makes things alive, like kind of what you're saying, like with the seeds, and that like we often are like grasping for certainty and like to understand what it is and like how's it going to end up and what's going to the end going to be. But there's actually something really fun and playful in the chaos.
One time I asked a poetry class to get, like the word trickster came up and I was like, what are your names for yourself? Like, let's dig into this. Oh, and people were saying mad scientist, alchemist, like high priestess, like all of these really cool archetypes were sort of controlled madness that I just thought were such good ways to think about creativity. Like, this is not an algebra equation. There's not one answer that you're going to get right. Like, that is, maybe you could see that as terrifying and horrible, but it's also just the coolest thing ever. Like, you're mad scientists in a lab.
It can be very fun. I think it can be uncomfortable too to sit with that kind of chaos and that uncertainty, even though it's necessary for the work. I was thinking of that idea of negative capability, which poets might know. It's an idea from John Keats, who's like the Romantic poet. I think he coined that term. And it's just this idea of sitting or dwelling with uncertainty, you know, and being able to exist in that space or create from that space, which I think can be really helpful, you know, because there is this impulse sometimes to control or to, you know, to figure out, well, how is, you know, like, how am I going to structure this piece exactly? Or, you know, what exactly am I trying to say here? But I think embracing the uncertainty of, well, I'm just going to dive into the material and muck around and see what emerges.
Something that stayed with me over the years, I was in a workshop with Amy Bender years ago, and she says, go where the energy is. Where is the kernel of energy? She would even base her whole workshop around talking about where in someone's story it feels most alive. We wouldn't often even talk about the other stuff, about what wasn't working. We'd talk about like, where does it feel most alive? Where do we feel that energy? And then how can there be more? How can this same feeling kind of be like pervade throughout the rest of it? So I thought that was just like where to start in the chaos. Maybe you start with the kernel that feels most alive, most energetic to you, and don't worry about how the other stuff will fit in. I'm going to go to one question that let's try to do a couple more questions before we have to end here. But Marcella's asking about what surprises have you had in your manuscript projects, or what has surprised you about the process? Does anyone have a sense of something that surprised you in the process? Kate, why don't we?
Yeah, I mean, the surprise is that I always know what to do. Like, eventually you always know what to do. And I think that's like, and the other thing is, like, I was thinking a lot about how our brains are just geared toward narrative and toward words. Our whole lives are constructed around communicating, and you're like, your brain will get you there. That's, you know, it's like every time I have a bad writing session and I'm like, I don't know what to do next, I sleep on it sometimes for a couple days, and then I'm like, there's a thing to try, you know, like, oh, well, here's a possible way out. And that might not work, but it's like the surprise for me was always that an idea that I had that maybe didn't work will always shift itself into something else if I don't force it. But I think that, like, you know, sometimes I think we talk about other art forms with much more grace than we give writing. I was listening to this NPR interview the other day about this concert pianist who practiced, you know, he would practice all day and be really stressed out about not getting the chords or whatever piece that they were trying to play. And every single time after he slept on it and woke up, he could play the piece. And like, I think that there's like, we can talk a lot about like, oh, the process is chaos or whatever, but sometimes I like to believe that like, it just feels like chaos in the moment, but my brain is like on it, you know, like, and I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that reframing is right, but in this craft book I like a lot, Chuck Wendig's Damn Fine Story, he talks about how like, even as kids, you're like 2, 3, you start doing imaginative play. Like we always like introduce a problem in the imaginative play and then try to solve it. Like we were just making up stories from the second that we're conscious. It's how we process the world. So like, I think I didn't put a lot of stock in early advice I got that was like, well, the novel will just reveal itself to you. I was so annoyed by stuff like that. But like the surprise is that, yeah, like it does kind of just become its own thing. So that, you know, if you can lean into allowing yourself to be surprised, then things feel a lot better, I think.
And I would say it actually is literally the way it works. Like chaos theory, the whole point of that is that then a thing emerges, or like flocking behavior in birds or schooling behavior in fish. It's a similar kind of thing. It actually is just how creativity works. That so it's not, I would argue, like, I think if you just look at the literal creation, not in the God way, but like in a how the actual universe like came out of the Big Bang, it's the same thing. Like it's how creativity works in this weird space between like chaos and then something coming together.
I'm going to go to one final question here. Courtney asks, I think it's Courtney, do any of you try the tough love approach with yourselves? So I guess that could be interpreted in a lot of ways, but do you feel that? I have an answer for this too, but I'll go to you guys first.
I don't do any tough love. I only do it when I want to do it. It's like, you got to want to do it. And that's just me. That's totally just me. But I am now beyond the place where I force myself to do any kind of writing that I don't want to do, because I feel like I just burn myself out. So I'm like, no, this is going to be an enjoyable a process as I can make it as I'm doing it. And that works really well for me.
I think tough love for me is deadline. If I have a deadline, then I'll take that big mess and I've just got to do something with it. Otherwise, I could play with the mess for a long time. So that's my tough love.
I think if tough love means the way you train a puppy really gently, bringing them back, then yes. But if tough love is code for, you know, all the other things it could be code for, then no.
I'll sort of like be tough on myself if I'm going down a rabbit hole of like, my book is bad, like that. I just, you know, like I can't say it enough. I just feel like this is what I see over and over and over again with students. Like, it's like the only thing that will kill a book is believing it's bad, like that. But so if I'm in a mood like that, I'll be sort of like, okay, we're done. And I might scold myself a little bit for going there in my mind, but like, no big deal. And I guess I'm trying to cultivate some rigidity around consistency and sitting down, like, but only because I know the book needs it right now. It's like I'm really close to the end of the draft, and it needs a lot of my attention. And I know that if I stray from it right now, it might sort of be more difficult to come back to. But categorically, I think tough love is kind of code for turning the process into something yucky feeling and thinking that that's going to get you the best result. But I just don't think that that's true.
Dorian, I know you wanted to jump in.
Oh yeah, just quickly, I don't do tough love in terms of like, you know, my butt is in the chair at 6 a.m. every morning, you know, that sort of tough love. But I think my brain does impose a kind of tough love on the projects that I'm working on, because I get kind of obsessive, you know, I obsess over the projects, and I won't be able to let them go even when I try. And sometimes I will put aside a piece where I've hit a wall with it, and feel like, okay, I'm done with that. And I'll move on to other things. But then my obsessive brain will, like a gravitational, you know, like a gravitational pull, it will just pull me back to that project eventually, usually. And I'll dig it out and I'll look at it again, and I'll keep tinkering with it or come back to it with, you know, a slightly new approach, and just keep working the material until I can get it into a form that I'm relatively happy with. So I don't know if that would qualify as tough love, but my brain can can really obsess and latch on to the projects that I've begun.
Love is in the term tough love. See, that's the thing people forget. Love is in that term. So if you're forgetting that love is in that term, then it's not tough love, it's just tough.
Yeah, I think we can get into the semantics of it too. I know we're at time, so unfortunately, I just wanted to quickly respond myself to that one, because I was thinking about, I agree with what everyone says, and yet I think that my own personal approach as a writer, there is a sense of I mean, we all are struggling with the inner critic, but there is a toughness that I feel I respond best to when I impose that on myself. And it doesn't always feel, I mean, yeah, it could be softer at times. It might be better for me if it were, but I do feel that there's something in my own, I guess the way I define it, the way I define tough love is that there's a standard I'm holding my work to, a logic and a rigor and an honesty that I feel like I want to impose on everything that I write. And I take a lot of space in between drafts. So it's not like it's fresh in my mind. It's stuff that I come back to months later, and it doesn't feel as vulnerable or it doesn't feel as raw. So that it's easier to impose that toughness on work that you didn't just gush out. And I do write every day. I know we all have different patterns around this, but it's something that I have realized that if I value writing, for me particularly, this is how my process works. If I want to ever finish certain things, and I want to think of myself as a creative person that has a very active process, I personally need to put in a little bit of time, even if it's working on a sentence or changing a comma. I need to sit down for some amount of time every day. I usually do it in the morning before anything else. And I just have to devote some degree of mental time to it. And that has helped me. I'm the first to suffer when I don't do that. So that's why I do that. So I think it's, again, I know however you need to set it up for yourself so that you can kind of make the process flow for you, I think is the right way. I'm so sorry that we're out of time. I know there were so many more questions, and there's just great questions, and I wish there should be more time to this, but we set this time for what it is. So does anyone on the panel have any closing words they want to leave? We might go a few minutes over here, but anyone want to share a final tip or advice? Or
I'll just say, fly your freak flag. Just do it. Just let it fly.
And one thing I was going to mention, and I think this really applies to memoir, is just to take it one piece at a time. So, to not try to hold the whole project you're working on, a book length project, in your head all at once every time you sit down at the computer or down with your pen and paper. But to chip away, and say, well, I'm going to work on this scene today or this fragment, and I'm going to give that fragment my full attention, and let the larger kind of structural concerns or the global concerns of the project kind of fall away a little bit. And then those little fragments will add up over time. And I think, as many people have mentioned, like the larger concerns of the project will kind of emerge.
Yeah. My last thing I'll say is stuff like outlining and stuff, and any kind of thing that some people might do. I have outlined only to the level that it really helps me in the moment figure out what I'm doing. So all of these things are tools, and you can kind of sample them all and see what helps you. And if an outline helps, like Dorian said, like maybe you're having trouble, instead of trying to hold the whole thing in your head, write an outline for yourself and see if that helps you organize your ideas. You don't have to, there's no rule that you have to stick to it after that. It can be whatever it is. So I'm going to end by just reading a quote that I had, another Elizabeth Gilbert quote. I just think it's such a positive, affirming way. I think her message in Big Magic is just a very open-minded and encouraging one about living a creative life. So she says, over the years, I found that if I just stayed with the process and didn't panic, I could pass safely through each stage of anxiety and on to the next level. I heartened myself with reminders that these fears were completely natural human reactions to interaction with the unknown. If I could convince myself that I was supposed to be there, that we are meant to engage with inspiration, and that inspiration wants to work with us, then I could usually get through my emotional minefield and continue her work on the project. So the idea that working and engaging with inspiration, and then it wants to kind of find a conduit out into the world. And if, however you conceive of it, I think cultivating mindsets like that can just make the whole process feel smoother, lighter. That's my sense. So thank you all again so much for being here. Thanks to joining us for the first time, and those of you who have come to many of our events. And panelists, thank you for sharing all that you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy.
We will be back, pretty much all of us, to talk about the year-long program next Sunday, November 21st, from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And there'll be a link posted on our website under events, and we'll also send out some stuff beforehand. You can RSVP on our website also if you want another reminder. And we'll be featuring a writer from each group. So you'll be able to hear a little sampling of what they do, and you'll hear the instructors talk a little bit more about their particular year-long workshops. So again, Carolyn leads the year-long poetry hybrid and year-long nonfiction. Dorian will be leading the year-long memoir next year. Kate leads our year-long novel workshops, both revision and first draft. There's 2 separate groups. And Sara Rauch leads the year-long short story workshop. So if you're at all interested in that kind of, in a program like that, or some sort of community around a book length project, you can join us and ask questions, and we'll be chatting about it next weekend. So thank you again, and good night to all.